Yeah, thanks for inviting me and to join this panel, which already gave me some good starting points, both of the speakers before. Yeah, youth unemployment is indeed I think the most discussed topic in the crisis, but maybe it's not so much a field which is addressed primarily if you look for solutions. I will try to explain you a little bit more about what are the crucial points with youth unemployment as an empirical concept when starting to discuss about youth unemployment in general. Maybe even there are limitations, especially when we compare different countries. Second is what is specific on youth unemployment from a life cost perspective. Maybe we already gain some arguments which make this group specific vulnerable compared to others, and maybe less easy to address by policy to improve the situation. And then I will go on with some specific findings, some descriptors, going to a kind of macro perspective, and in the end I try to link the micro and the macro perspective and make some conclusions at the end. Okay, youth unemployment as a kind of public figure that by definition deals with people aged 15 to 24 years old. So I think that's not, meanwhile, more and more, that's not a really good instrument. Maybe it's much better to look at the first maybe 5 years of people entering the labor market, which describes much better the real problems, and we will find some answers during my presentation. At least because if you fix to 24 years as a limit, we cut all the academic graduates in Germany or the middle of Europe. We are focused much more on the lower qualified people. We have no entry episodes of the upper qualified. If you look into the Bologna process, for example, now we have a change in the timelines. Maybe countries who have adopted to the bachelor-master system compared to the diploma now have academic graduates below 25, which never occurred on the labor market before. So this means the measure of youth unemployment is a little bit sensitive to countries and over time within countries. So it's not easy to compare, and everybody should be very, very careful in comparing situations. The definition of the unemployment by standard is clear. It's without job, looking for a job, actively seeking for a job, and mostly in most countries being registered as unemployed. New debates try to enlarge this debate. For example, the NEET concept, the excluded youth concept, or the disconnected, which again address the problem I mentioned, that the definition is very sensitive and maybe addressing a subgroup of young people. In the case young people are not benefit recipients, maybe they never become registered as unemployed at the unemployment offices, as a labor market services. So we have a kind of hidden population which are not covered by youth unemployment rates or youth unemployment figures. And this again could be different over different countries. All right. Despite these problems, I start with the public official youth unemployment rate data from the European Labour Force Survey data. What you see for the European area is a very specific decrease of the youth unemployment rate in the last uprise of the business cycle around 2007 and early 2008, and then the increase of the youth unemployment rate still going on, but with a flatter tour since 2010. If we decompose this to the different countries of Europe, I will not go into detail with the countries here, but even if you have a very general view to these charts, you can see that the same periods, youth unemployment rates developed completely different in different European countries. So this average youth unemployment rate is completely different from what's going on within the countries, both depending on the levels and of the turn within the last decade. So again, we have completely different stories. It's not simple, a kind of a general crisis. Maybe much more is inside. One thing is, again, if we already heard it from David Bell a little bit in the beginning. When we compare youth unemployment rate with the adult unemployment rate, we can calculate a kind of ratio, which means the higher the ratio, the higher the vulnerability of young people compared to the adults. What we see is that almost during the whole last decade, the vulnerability of young people rised, which means young people have a rising risk of becoming unemployed already much long before the crisis. It amplified at the first years of the crisis, and then the ratio goes down. The ratio goes down because of, in the longer term of the crisis, all the adults came into unemployment and the ratio changed and equalized more. But the real story behind this, there must happen something much more in the last decade, maybe on institutional factors, which rise the risk of becoming unemployed for young people, and it's not as simple as the crisis, which resulted in the picture we have now. So, to summarize the first part, the rise of youth unemployment, this is a specific unemployment risk of young people with a longer story than a crisis story. It has amplified in the first years of the crisis and then detoured, which means then the other process takes over. We have country-specific differences and we have severe measurement effects in comparing with unemployment. Let me look into some subgroups. And it's interesting what's happening with some subgroups like gender, for example. The risk of becoming unemployed changed in the gender perspective during the crisis. The stories behind this mostly sector-driven, male, some sectors with majority of male employed are more targeted, for example, by the crisis, which means females performed on average better than the young males. They are less affected by the unemployment risk. Different story for the people with the same citizen, like the reporting country, or vice versa, the foreigners, as a more generous construct. But you can see the gap between foreigners and locals has widened already before the crisis and very precisely within the crisis. Again, this indicates a more general process behind. The third thing is education. When we started at the year 2001, we see a strong division between low qualified with the highest risk of unemployment, medium level qualified, mostly vocational training, secondary graduates, and the academics on the lowest level. These are the orange line. In the years 2000, this three triangulation changed to a dual concept with a high risk of low qualified people compared to all the others with upper secondary, vocational or tertiary education. So again, education is a strong indicator on this story. Yeah, I'm proceeding. And the last thing is duration of unemployment. We can see the proportion of short-time unemployed young people, unemployed below 6 months, was increasing till the recession has started. This again gives us a little bit of the story about what's going on. Young people have a higher risk of short-time unemployment. More inside of unemployment, maybe also more outside when the circumstances allow it. If the case is not possible, like the crisis, then unemployment becomes longer on a higher level of average unemployment. That is a nice mechanism. We have to look more for the analysis. Okay, to summarize, risk of unemployment experience rised and the share of short-time unemployment spells increased during the years 2000 and changed in the years of the crisis. What are driving factors? One is, of course, and very precisely, GDP. The business cycle affects youth unemployment much more than the general unemployment rate. The correlation is much higher. You can see it here, very easily described with these figures. The red line is the youth unemployment rate, green line adult unemployment rate, and the blue line is the GDP development. On the other side, we have demographic change. Demographic change is much more complex because we have two factors. One is change of fertility, which is long times ago, and the second is migration or mobility. What you can see is that For example, the Nordic countries who perform good in unemployment terms even have an increase in youth population, both due to fertility rise and to immigration. On the other side, in the southern countries or the eastern countries, we have a decrease in the young population, which should lower the effect for unemployed because the population is decreasing. But still, in this area, we have a tremendous increase in unemployment. So the decrease of population was sometimes caused by fertility and of mobility out of these countries. So this is very tricky to analyze because we have the interaction of fertility and migration process, especially during the crisis years. The causality is not easy to disentangle. So, to summarize, we have some business side effects, very, very strong targeting young unemployment, youth unemployment, and we have a very complex demographic factor which can relax unemployment pressure in some countries, but even then it looks like it doesn't really help. The countries with the lowest fertility rates have the highest unemployment rates, so there's a very nice interaction on this field also. The last field I tried to combine a more analytic frame to go very easily and very quickly through this picture is on the very macro level we can find over all European countries. Yes, we have a very strong macro effect of the GDP, and much more on the lagged GDP, which means the more ongoing the crisis is, the more powerful is the GDP effect on youth unemployment. We have in the simple models where we are able to control for the dual system, countries with a dual system have much lower youth unemployment rates, but they would be cautious to interpret dual system as a solution for the crisis because we know from Germany that the dual system itself, it's very sensitive to crisis effects. And we could observe this, for example, in Ireland or in Serbia or in Greece, which had built small apprenticeship systems, like the construction system in Ireland or the trade system in Serbia or Croatia, which disappeared completely during the crisis because no enterprise was interested in employing apprentices. So in general, that's a good field, but in crisis, it's not really good, not really helpful. What seems to be important is the share of people employed in the production area. The higher the share of employment in the production, the lower youth unemployment. This seems to be a more or less stable factor, and the general educational level of the whole population, not only of the young people, is a stabilizing factor for reducing youth unemployment as a kind of macro concept here. In the next step, I should cut this, I combined the micro and the macro level. At first I switched to population perspective. I really was interested in the first 5 years of being in the labor market, and I subsplit this group in the first years of the labor market and the third to fifth years in the labor market. In this part of the analysis, then I looked for the interaction between educational level and labor market experience. And what we can see, academics have the highest risk of unemployment in the first 2 years of being in the labor market. This is search time. They are looking for a good job and they have to take time to become placed well. After the third year, the risk is completely vice versa. Now academics have the lowest risk of becoming unemployed, while the low qualified in all periods have a tremendous high risk. The vocational trained are in between. Here we can see, again, to the comparison of youth unemployment rates, it's much better to have a kind of fixed observation window. We have a much better explanation what's going on over time. If we then add on macro levels like the GDP development, the share of inactivities, the industrial share, we can see the macroeconomic factors have an independent power of explanation beyond that what's going on the official level within the countries. There's not the time to go into detail now, but I think as a general story that's sufficient for now. To conclude, the strong labor market entrance effect and age effects we have seen at the later thing, especially the entrance effect is very interesting from a theoretical point. Education protects from unemployment in every country. Even the detailed analysts show this. Education is the best protector we can find. But of course it does not protect from the risk of becoming unemployed in the very first period of looking for a starting point. Firm-based apprenticeship training smoothens the training to work transition, but as I mentioned, it's a little bit business cycle sensitive. And from this point, not really helpful in the crisis years. Gender and migration background effects are severe and are necessary to become exploited much more by the research. And beyond that, we have very severe regional effects. These are effects who are dominated in the crisis, mainly, of course, by the GDP effects and maybe by the population effects, the demographic effects, which I mentioned in my presentation. Thank you very much.